The surgical forceps trembled in Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hand as February's blizzard hammered against the operating room windows, the same rhythmic pounding that had echoed through Veterans Hospital corridors 49 years ago when boys came home in pieces. What she extracted from Robert Sullivan's back wasn't the melanoma they'd expected. The metallic fragment caught the surgical lights like a dying star, and suddenly Nurse Patricia's 30 years of steady hands began to shake. The instrument tray crashed to the floor with the sound of artillery fire, metal against tile, while the tissue around the empty cavity writhed and reorganized itself before their eyes. "Get Dr. Crawford in here now," Mitchell commanded, her voice steady despite the impossible sight. Outside, the storm intensified, and somewhere in the waiting room, Margaret Sullivan pressed weathered palms against frosted glass, watching snow fall like ash over a battlefield she'd tried 50 years to forget. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 48 hours before the scream that would shatter everything, Robert "Bob" Sullivan sat in his favorite leather recliner, watching February snow bury Millbrook, Michigan, under 2 feet of pristine white silence. At 65, he remained as solid as the oak beams he'd wired in countless houses during his 40-year career as an electrician, his broad shoulders only slightly stooped from decades of crawling through attics and basements. The Bronze Star tucked away in his dresser drawer spoke of courage he never discussed, and the small scar on his lower back had been just a mole for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret Maggie Sullivan emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her soft blue eyes crinkling at the corners as she settled into the chair beside her husband of 46 years. At 63, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 30 years managing classrooms full of energetic third graders before retiring to tend their modest lakeside home. What Bob didn't know, what nobody knew, was that before she became the beloved Mrs. Sullivan of Millbrook Elementary, Margaret had spent 2 years as a battlefield nurse in Vietnam, patching up boys who looked just like the young man she would eventually marry. Their daughter Lisa would arrive tomorrow from Chicago, where she worked as an emergency room physician, her medical degree a source of immense pride for parents who had never attended college themselves. At 40, Lisa had inherited her mother's gentle strength and her father's stubborn determination, qualities that served her well in the chaotic world of trauma medicine. Their only grandchild, 5-year-old Sophie, possessed the brutal honesty that only kindergartners could deliver with such devastating innocence. The Sullivan home sat 3 blocks from Lake Michigan, close enough to hear the waves during winter storms, but far enough to afford on a working man's pension. The blue shutters needed painting, and the front porch steps had begun to sag, but 40 years of mortgage payments had made it theirs. Inside, family photographs documented a life built on steady love and shared silences. Bob in his work clothes proudly displaying the deck he'd built by hand. Baby Lisa sleeping in her father's massive arms. Anniversary cruises where they'd learned to dance together all over again. What the photographs couldn't capture were the nightmares that sometimes woke Bob in the dark hours before dawn, or the way Maggie's hands occasionally trembled when helicopters flew overhead. They had built their marriage on the unspoken agreement that some doors were better left closed, some memories better left buried beneath the comfortable routines of coffee on the porch and Sunday dinners with extended family. And Tommy Peterson, Bob's war buddy and the closest thing to a brother he had left, lived 1 town over and stopped by monthly with stories about fishing and grandchildren, carefully avoiding any mention of the jungle where they had both learned that survival sometimes required terrible choices. Of their original unit, only Tommy and Bob remained, carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. The evening that would change everything began like any other February night in the Sullivan household. Margaret had spent the afternoon preparing Bob's favorite anniversary dinner, pot roast with root vegetables and her grandmother's cornbread recipe that always earned him a second helping. Their tradition remained unchanged after 46 years. Home-cooked meal, a single glass of champagne, and dancing to Sam Cooke's You Send Me in the living room where they'd practiced their wedding dance so many decades ago. She laid out Bob's good blue shirt on their bed, the one she'd given him 3 Christmases ago that brought out the faded color of his eyes. Outside their bedroom window, snow had begun falling in thick, lazy flakes that caught the last rays of winter sunlight and transformed their modest neighborhood into something magical. The lake beyond their backyard had frozen solid weeks ago, creating a vast white canvas that stretched to the horizon. "Bob, you about ready?" "Dinner's almost done," Margaret called from the doorway, wiping her hands on her favorite apron, the one with sunflowers that Lisa had sent from Chicago last Mother's Day. Bob emerged from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist, droplets of water still clinging to his silver hair. Despite 65 years and all the wear that came with a working man's life, Margaret still felt that familiar flutter in her chest when she looked at him. He had aged well, she thought, still strong and handsome in that weathered way of men who had spent their lives building things with their hands. "Need help with those buttons?" she asked, knowing his arthritis sometimes made the small pearl buttons difficult to manage. It was their familiar dance, his insistence on independence, her quiet assistance, neither acknowledging the gentle compromise that had become second nature after so many years together. "I can manage," he insisted, but stood still as Margaret approached to help anyway. As she helped him slip the shirt over his shoulders, Margaret's hands stilled against the fabric, the mole between his shoulder blades, the one she'd noticed countless times during their summer trips to the lake, had changed dramatically since she'd last really looked at it. What had been a dark, roughly circular spot about the size of a pencil eraser had transformed into something larger, with irregular borders that seemed to reach outward like grasping fingers. "Bob," she said carefully, using the tone that had served her well with both stubborn students and stubborn husbands, "when did this mole start changing shape?" Bob shrugged, reaching for his comb with the casual dismissal she knew so well. "It's fine, Maggie. Been there forever." "It's different," she insisted, her teacher's voice emerging, the one that brooked no argument from even the most defiant third grader. "It's bigger and the edges are all wrong." "Of course it's changed. I'm older." "Everything changes." Frank met her eyes in the mirror, his expression softening at her obvious concern. "Anniversary night isn't for doctor talk, honey. Let's enjoy our evening." Margaret reluctantly finished helping him with his shirt, but her mind remained fixed on what she'd seen. Throughout dinner, she found herself watching Bob's movements, looking for any sign of discomfort or pain. The pot roast was perfect, the cornbread golden brown, but she barely tasted any of it. Bob caught her staring more than once, responding with a wink or a squeeze of her hand, misinterpreting her worry for romantic reminiscence. They were clearing the dinner dishes together when the doorbell rang, interrupting their quiet evening routine. "That'll be the anniversary flowers from Lisa," Bob said, drying his hands on the kitchen towel. "She mentioned sending something special this year." Instead, when Margaret opened the door, she found their daughter-in-law Jessica standing on the front porch with little Sophie bundled in a pink winter coat, both of them dusted with snow like sugar cookies. "Surprise," Jessica said, stamping snow off her boots. "We were driving back from my mother's in Grand Rapids and thought we'd stop by to wish you happy anniversary. Hope we're not interrupting anything special." "Never," Margaret said, genuinely pleased despite her preoccupation. "Come in out of this cold before you both turn into snowmen." Sophie bounded into the house with the boundless energy that only 5-year-olds possessed, rushing straight to Bob, who scooped her up in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "Grandpa, I lost another tooth," she announced proudly, displaying the gap in her smile with the satisfaction of a child who had accomplished something magnificent. "Well now, the tooth fairy's going to go broke keeping up with you," Bob teased, setting her down gently and helping her out of her tiny snow boots. What happened next would forever divide Margaret's life into before and after. Bob had crouched down to help Sophie with a stubborn zipper, his back turned to the little girl as he worked the metal pull with patient concentration. Sophie, peering over his shoulder with the curious intensity that made her such a delight, suddenly pointed and asked in that crystal-clear voice of childhood innocence, "Grandpa, why do you have a spider living on your back?" The room fell silent as if the winter storm outside had suddenly stopped breathing. Jessica's nervous laugh died in her throat as she looked from Sophie to the adults, whose faces had drained of color. Margaret felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "Emma, don't be silly," Jessica said quickly, using the gentle but firm tone mothers employed when children said inappropriate things. "Grandpa doesn't have any spiders." But Sophie persisted with the relentless honesty that only 5-year-olds possessed. "It does look like a spider, Mommy. Like the big black one we found in our bathtub last week. The one with the bumpy back and all those legs." Bob straightened slowly, his weathered face growing pale beneath his perpetual tan. He reached awkwardly behind himself, trying to feel what Sophie had seen, but the location made it impossible for his arthritic joints to reach. "There's no spider, sweetheart," he said gently, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Grandpa just has an old spot there. Had it since I was in the Army." Margaret moved toward him with the purposeful stride she'd perfected during 30 years of managing classroom crises. "Bob, let me see," she said quietly, but her voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "It's nothing, Maggie," he protested, but he was already turning around, lifting the back of his shirt with hands that trembled slightly. When Margaret saw what Sophie had innocently described, she had to grip Bob's shoulder to steady herself. The mole had indeed transformed into something that resembled a spider in the most unsettling way possible. The central mass had grown darker and more raised, while irregular extensions spread outward like legs reaching across his pale skin. The texture appeared different too, rougher, almost scaly in places. "Bob," she said, keeping her voice as calm as possible, "I'm taking a picture of this with my phone, and you're going to look at it." For once, Bob didn't argue. When Margaret showed him the photograph on her phone's screen, his face went white. The growth looked even more disturbing in the harsh flash of the camera, a dark, spider-like mass with appendages that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "Jesus," he whispered, then quickly glanced at Sophie and added, "Sorry, honey." "I'm calling Dr. Grayson first thing tomorrow morning," Margaret announced. "No arguments, Robert Sullivan." Bob nodded, the sight of the growth apparently shocking him into uncharacteristic compliance. The casual dismissal he'd maintained for months crumbled in the face of photographic evidence. Jessica gathered Sophie's coat and boots, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. "We should probably head home," she said gently. "Let you folks have your anniversary evening." After they left, the house felt colder, despite the warmth from the heating system Bob had installed himself 20 years earlier. Margaret sat beside her husband on their worn sofa, studying the photograph again while Bob stared out the window at the falling snow. "How long has it been like this?" she asked softly. Bob was quiet for a long moment before admitting, "It's been changing for a while, maybe 6 months. But Maggie, it never looked like that. Why didn't you tell me it was getting worse?" He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd rarely witnessed in 46 years of marriage. Genuine fear. "Because I hoped it would go away." "Because I'm 65 years old and we've got a good life. And I didn't want to mess that up with doctor visits and tests and all that medical nonsense." Margaret reached for his calloused hand, intertwining their fingers the way they had since their first date in 1975. "Bob, we're going to face whatever this is together, but no more hiding things from me, okay?" That night, Margaret lay awake listening to Bob's breathing beside her. Around midnight, she heard him stirring restlessly, muttering words she couldn't quite make out. When she touched his shoulder, he jerked awake with a sharp intake of breath. "You were having a nightmare," she said gently. Bob sat up, running his hands through his silver hair. "Same dream I've been having for weeks. I'm back in Vietnam, and something's crawling on me. Can't see what it is, but I can feel it moving under my skin." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Bob, how long have you been having these dreams?" "Since around Christmas, maybe before." He looked at her with embarrassed vulnerability. "Maggie, I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes when I'm awake, I swear I can feel that thing on my back. Moving." The next morning dawned gray and bitter, with fresh snow continuing to fall. Margaret was on the phone to Dr. Grayson's office before 8 o'clock, explaining the situation to his receptionist with barely contained urgency. "Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Grayson can see Bob this afternoon at 2, the receptionist said, "but he wants me to tell you that if there are any sudden changes, bleeding, severe pain, anything unusual, you should come in immediately." Dr. Grayson had been their family physician for 15 years, a semi-retired doctor who had known Bob since his move to Millbrook. When he examined the growth that afternoon, his usual jovial demeanor disappeared entirely. "Bob, I'm referring you to a specialist," he said, already writing on his prescription pad. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She's a dermatologist who just moved here from Boston. Young, but brilliant. I'm calling her office personally to get you in this week." "How serious is this, Doc?" Bob asked, attempting his usual nonchalance but failing to hide his concern. Dr. Grayson met his eyes directly. "I don't want to speculate, but this needs expert attention immediately. The growth pattern, the irregular borders, the rapid changes you've described, these are all red flags that we can't ignore." In the car afterward, Bob stared silently out the passenger window at the snow-covered landscape while Margaret gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. "It's going to be okay," she said, though uncertainty edged her voice. "If it's what I think it might be," Bob said quietly, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't tell Lisa until we know for sure. No sense worrying her if this turns out to be nothing." Margaret nodded, though she suspected they were already well past the point of nothing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office occupied the top floor of Millbrook's newest medical building, its sleek furniture and calming blue walls a stark contrast to Dr. Grayson's decades-old practice with its worn leather chairs and faded hunting magazines. Margaret sat beside Bob in the waiting room, watching him pretend to read a Sports Illustrated from 2019 while his knuckles turned white around the magazine's edges. At 38, Dr. Mitchell was younger than Margaret had expected, with intelligent brown eyes behind stylish glasses and a warm smile that immediately put Margaret at ease despite her growing anxiety. She introduced herself with a firm handshake, then addressed Bob directly with the kind of professional respect that acknowledged his dignity. "Mr. Sullivan, Dr. Grayson sent over his notes, but I'd like to examine the area myself, if that's all right," she said, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. Bob nodded, already unbuttoning his flannel shirt with the methodical precision of a man preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. As he turned and sat on the examination table, Dr. Mitchell's professional composure flickered for just a moment. Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly collected herself. "How long have you had this growth, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, taking photographs with a specialized medical camera. "Had a mole there since Vietnam," Bob answered, his voice steady despite the tension Margaret could see in his shoulders. "Been changing lately, though." "Define lately for me," Dr. Mitchell prompted, examining the growth without touching it yet. "Noticeable changes in the past 6 months," Margaret interjected when Bob hesitated. "But dramatic changes just in the past few weeks." Dr. Mitchell nodded, making notes on her tablet. "And any symptoms?" Pain? Itching? Bleeding? Some discomfort recently, Bob admitted reluctantly. Nothing I can't handle. He's been having nightmares, Margaret added, ignoring Bob's sharp look. And he said sometimes it feels warm or like it's moving. Instead of dismissing these concerns, Dr. Mitchell leaned closer to examine the growth more carefully. Movement sensations aren't uncommon with certain types of growths. The surrounding nerve endings can create unusual sensations. She pressed gently around the edges of the growth, causing Bob to flinch involuntarily. "Sorry," she said. "I need to check the borders and see how deep this extends." After several more minutes of examination, Dr. Mitchell stepped back and removed her gloves. "I'd like to do a biopsy today, if you're comfortable with that. It's a standard procedure where we remove a small sample for laboratory analysis." "A biopsy," Bob repeated, the word heavy with implication. "That's where you cut out a piece to test it." "Exactly. We'll numb the area first, of course. The procedure will give us the information we need to determine the best course of treatment." "Treatment for what?" Margaret asked, her heart racing. Dr. Mitchell met her eyes directly. "I don't want to speculate until we have the biopsy results, but this doesn't present like a typical melanoma or basal cell carcinoma. The structure is quite unusual, and I'm concerned enough that I'd like to expedite the results. We should know something within 48 hours. The biopsy procedure was quick but tense. Despite the local anesthetic, Bob winced when Dr. Mitchell extracted a small portion of the growth. Margaret noticed the doctor's frown as she placed the sample in a sterile container. "The tissue is denser than I expected," Dr. Mitchell commented, almost to herself. "I'm going to take one more sample from a different area if that's all right." The second sample seemed to trouble her even more. She labeled both containers carefully before addressing them again. "I'm sending these to our laboratory today with a priority processing request," she said, handing Bob a care instruction sheet. "Please keep the area clean and dry. If you notice any increased pain, bleeding, or other changes, call my office immediately, day or night. I've written my cell phone number on the back of my card." In the car ride home, Margaret finally voiced the fear that had been building since Dr. Mitchell's initial reaction. "She's more worried than she's saying." Bob stared straight ahead at the snowy road. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Maggie. Could still be nothing." "Robert Sullivan, in 46 years of marriage, I've never known you to be a liar," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Don't start now." That evening, Tommy Peterson arrived unannounced, stamping snow off his boots in their entryway. His weathered face carried an expression Margaret had learned to recognize over the decades, the look of a man bringing difficult news. "Heard from Patty down at the clinic that Bob's got some kind of growth they're checking out," he said without preamble. Patty Johnson, Tommy's sister-in-law, worked as a nurse at the medical center, and news traveled fast in small towns. "Show him," Tommy said to Bob, his tone carrying the authority of shared experience that transcended normal social conventions. The two men had been through too much together for Bob to refuse. Bob turned and lifted his shirt, revealing the bandaged area. "Under the bandage?" Tommy asked. "What's the shape of it?" Bob glanced at Margaret. "Sort of spider-like, I guess. Sophie called it that." Tommy's face went pale as winter moonlight. "Thought so," he said heavily, sinking into their worn recliner. "Johnson had something similar." "Johnson?" Bob's voice sharpened. "You mean Carl Johnson from Charlie Company?" "That's him. Radio man from Ohio. Good poker player." Tommy stared at his hands. "Ran into his widow about 5 years back at a VA event in Grand Rapids. She told me he died from some weird cancer. Started as what they thought was a mole on his back. By the time they figured out what it really was, it had spread everywhere." Margaret felt the room tilt around her. Did they ever determine what caused it? Tommy shrugged, but his casual gesture couldn't hide the weight of his words. VA doctors had some theory about Agent Orange exposure, said it created some unique type of cancer they hadn't seen before in other cases. He looked directly at Bob. "You were with us in the Blue Zone, weren't you?" Bob nodded grimly. 3 weeks in 71. "The Blue Zone?" Margaret asked, though something cold in her stomach told her she didn't want to know. "What we called the areas that got the heaviest chemical spraying," Tommy explained. "You could tell because all the vegetation turned blue before it died. Everything, trees, grass, crops." "Just blue?" "Then nothing." The three sat in heavy silence, the only sound the whisper of wind against windows and the steady tick of the mantel clock Bob had inherited from his father. Finally, Tommy spoke again. "There's something else you should know, Bob. Before Johnson died, he told his wife the same thing you've been telling Maggie. He thought the thing on his back was moving." That night was the longest of Margaret's life. Bob slept fitfully beside her, occasionally muttering in his sleep. Fragments of words that sounded like radio codes and place names she didn't recognize. Around 3 in the morning, she felt him sit up suddenly, his breathing rapid and shallow. "The dream again?" she asked softly. "Worse this time," he admitted. "I could see it clearly. This black thing with legs, crawling under my skin. And Maggie." He turned to face her in the darkness. "In the dream, it wasn't just moving. It was growing." The call from Doctor Mitchell came the next afternoon, earlier than expected. Margaret was folding laundry in the bedroom when the phone rang, and something in the doctor's tone made her immediately call for Bob. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for taking my call," Dr. Mitchell began. "I've received preliminary results from the laboratory, and I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning to discuss them in person." "Just tell us now, Doc," Bob said, his voice gruff with barely contained anxiety. "Is it cancer?" There was a pause that lasted forever. "The results are complex. There are abnormal cells present that share some characteristics with melanoma, but there are other findings that don't fit that diagnosis at all." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, gripping Bob's hand. "It means we need to do a more extensive examination. I've consulted with Dr. James Crawford, an oncologist here at our hospital system. He's agreed to see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. "I'll be there as well." After they hung up, Bob stood silently by the kitchen counter, staring out at the snow-covered lake. Margaret waited, knowing her husband well enough to recognize when he needed time to process difficult information. "Knew a guy in my unit," he said finally. "Got some kind of jungle rot that the medics couldn't figure out. Turned out he had some kind of parasite that had burrowed under his skin and been living there for months." He looked at Margaret, his blue eyes haunted. "You think that's what this is? Some Vietnamese bug that's been living in me all these years?" The question chilled Margaret to the bone because the thought had already occurred to her, not from Bob's military service, but from her own hidden past. During her time as a battlefield nurse, she had seen strange tropical infections, conditions that weren't in any medical textbook, diseases that seemed to lie dormant for years before suddenly manifesting in devastating ways. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but whatever it is, we'll face it together." That evening brought another unexpected visitor. Dr. Mitchell herself appeared at their door just after 7, her professional demeanor replaced by something more personal, more urgent. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," she said, accepting Margaret's invitation to come in from the cold, "but I wanted to discuss something with you before tomorrow's appointment." She sat on their sofa, declining Margaret's offer of coffee, and opened her laptop computer. "I've been researching similar cases throughout the afternoon, and I found something that might be relevant." She turned the screen toward them, showing a medical journal article with photographs that made Margaret's stomach clench. This case was documented at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in 1987. a Vietnam veteran with a growth remarkably similar to yours, Mr. Sullivan. Same spider-like appearance, same location, same behavioral characteristics. What happened to him? Bob asked quietly. Dr. Mitchell's expression was grave. The growth was successfully removed, but the case raised important questions about long-term effects of chemical exposure during the war. The patient recovered fully and lived another 20 years before dying of unrelated causes. She closed the laptop and looked at both of them directly. I want you to know that whatever we're dealing with, you're not facing it alone. I've already reached out to specialists at Walter Reed and the VA hospital in Detroit. If this is related to your military service, Mr. Sullivan, there are resources available to help us understand and treat it. After Dr. Mitchell left, Margaret and Bob sat together on their sofa, holding hands in the lamplight while snow continued to fall outside their windows. For the first time in 46 years of marriage, the silence between them felt fragile, as if the wrong word might shatter something precious and irreplaceable. The waiting room of Millbrook Regional Hospital's oncology department felt colder than the February morning outside, despite the heating system that hummed constantly against the bitter Michigan winter. Margaret sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching Bob flip through a months-old Time magazine without seeing the pages. They had barely spoken during the drive to the hospital, each lost in their own thoughts after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl through the bare branches of their maple tree. Lisa had driven up from Chicago the night before, making the 3-hour journey through a snowstorm that had dumped another 6 inches on the already overburdened landscape. At 40, she still looked like the serious little girl who had once declared she wanted to fix people when she grew up, and now, as an emergency physician, she had fulfilled that childhood ambition in ways none of them could have imagined. Robert and Margaret Sullivan? A nurse in navy blue scrubs appeared at the consultation room door, clipboard in hand. Dr. Crawford and Dr. Mitchell are ready for you. They followed her down a hallway lined with framed watercolor paintings of peaceful lake scenes, an attempt at creating calm that only heightened Margaret's anxiety. The consultation room contained a small conference table rather than an examination bed, suggesting this was a meeting for serious discussion rather than routine treatment. Dr. Mitchell greeted them with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and beside her stood Dr. James Crawford, a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had delivered difficult news countless times before, his handshake firm and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. "Thank you for coming in," Dr. Crawford began once they were seated around the polished table. "Dr. Mitchell has shared the biopsy results with me, and I've reviewed them thoroughly. We've also consulted with a pathologist at the University of Michigan Medical Center to get additional perspective on these findings." "Just give it to us straight, Doctor," Bob said, his voice gruff with the kind of directness that had served him well through 65 years of life. "What are we dealing with here?" Dr. Crawford nodded, appreciating Bob's no-nonsense approach. "The biopsy shows characteristics of an atypical melanoma, but with several very unusual features. The cellular structure is quite distinctive, not something we commonly see in standard cases." "Is it from Agent Orange?" Margaret asked, remembering Tommy's story about Carl Johnson. "My husband was exposed during his service in Vietnam." The two doctors exchanged glances before Dr. Mitchell spoke. "That's certainly one possibility we're considering. There have been documented cases of rare cancers linked to chemical exposure during the war, though they typically present differently than what we're seeing here." "But there's something else," Dr. Crawford added, opening a folder on the table and turning it so they could see photographs of the biopsy samples magnified to show cellular details that meant nothing to Margaret or Bob. "The growth appears to have developed around some type of foreign material embedded in the tissue." "Foreign material?" Bob repeated, his weathered face showing the first crack in the stoic composure he'd maintained since this ordeal began. Something that doesn't belong in human tissue, Dr. Crawford clarified gently. We won't know exactly what it is until we remove the entire growth and analyze it comprehensively. Based on the imaging studies and the biopsy findings, it appears this foreign object has been there for quite some time, possibly decades. Lisa leaned forward in her chair, her medical training engaging despite her personal concern. What kind of foreign object could survive in tissue for that long without causing problems? That's exactly what we intend to find out, Dr. Mitchell said. I've scheduled surgery for tomorrow morning. We need to remove the entire growth and whatever is embedded within it. This isn't something we want to leave in place any longer than necessary. Bob leaned back in his chair, fixing both doctors with the steady gaze that had intimidated subcontractors and reassured nervous homeowners for 4 decades. Level with me. Is this thing going to kill me? Dr. Crawford removed his glasses, meeting Bob's eyes directly with the kind of honesty that comes from years of practice delivering life-changing news. Without removal and proper treatment, it could eventually become life-threatening, yes. But caught at this stage with appropriate surgical intervention, your prognosis should be quite good. We simply need more information, which we'll get from the complete removal and analysis. Margaret felt her throat tighten as the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. Beside her, Bob reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had sustained them through 46 years of marriage, through job losses and family deaths, and all the small crises that make up a shared life. "How soon can we do this?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., Dr. Mitchell replied. "I know that seems fast, but given the unusual nature of this growth and the changes you've described, I don't want to delay. We'll have Dr. Crawford assisting, along with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who specializes in complex dermatological surgeries." After signing consent forms and receiving pre-surgical instructions that filled 2 pages with warnings and procedures, they made their way back to the parking lot where Lisa was waiting in her rental car, engine running to ward off the bitter cold that had settled over Michigan like a punishment. "How did it go?" she asked as they climbed into the warm interior, her breath visible in small puffs despite the heating. "Surgery tomorrow," Bob said simply, buckling his seatbelt with the methodical precision he applied to all tasks. "They think there's something foreign embedded in the growth. Been there for years, maybe decades." Lisa absorbed this information with the clinical detachment she'd learned in medical school, but Margaret could see the worry in her daughter's eyes. "What kind of foreign object?" "Won't know until they get it out," Bob replied, staring out the window at the snow-covered parking lot where other families were arriving for their own medical appointments, their own life-changing conversations with doctors who spoke in careful, measured tones. That evening, Tommy Peterson arrived at their house carrying a small, worn Bible in his weathered hands. "Thought Bob might want this nearby tomorrow," he said, placing it on their kitchen table. "It's the one he carried in country. Had it in my footlocker all these years. He gave it to me for safekeeping before that mission to Quang Tri. Said if anything happened to him, he wanted his folks back home to have it." Margaret examined the small book, its pages yellowed with age and cover faded from handling. "He never mentioned giving this to you." Tommy shrugged, his expression carrying the weight of decades of unspoken understanding between old soldiers. "Lot of things we didn't mention after coming home. Seemed easier that way." He looked at Bob, who had emerged from the bedroom where he'd been packing an overnight bag for the hospital. "How you holding up, old friend?" "Been better," Bob admitted with a wry smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Been worse, too." "You remember Johnson mentioning anything about foreign objects? Metal fragments? Shrapnel? Anything like that?" Bob shook his head slowly. Never talked about it in detail, just said he had this growing thing on his back that the VA couldn't figure out. He paused, his expression growing distant. Though, now that I think about it, he did mention having strange dreams, said he could feel something moving under his skin. Tommy's weathered face grew pale. Same dreams you've been having? Yeah. Same dreams. The two men looked at each other with the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience in places most people never see, carrying memories most people never have to carry. Margaret watched this silent communication between her husband and his oldest friend, recognizing that there were aspects of Bob's past she might never fully comprehend, no matter how much she loved him. "There's something I need to tell you both," Tommy said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of long-kept secrets. Johnson wasn't the only one. Dave Wilson, you remember Wilson, Bob, the kid from Nebraska who played harmonica? He died in '85. Liver cancer, they said, but his widow told me at the funeral that it started with a growth on his back. Same description, same symptoms. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. How many others? Don't know for sure, Tommy admitted. Our unit got scattered after we rotated home. Some guys I lost touch with completely. But of the ones I kept track of, Johnson, Wilson, and now Bob, that's 3 out of our squad of 12. What about you? Bob asked quietly. Tommy pulled up his shirt, revealing a back marked with old scars but no unusual growths. Clean so far. But I think about it every time I shower, every time my wife mentions a new spot or mole. Wonder if I'm next. After Tommy left, Margaret and Bob sat together in their living room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes, each sound marking time that suddenly felt precious and limited. "Maggie," Bob said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if something goes wrong tomorrow—" "Nothing's going wrong," she interrupted firmly, using the tone that had ended countless arguments over the decades. "But if it does," he continued with the stubborn persistence she knew so well, "there's a metal box bolted under my workbench in the garage. Combination is your birthday, April 22nd, '84. If something happens to me, you need to know what's in there." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "You can show me yourself when you're feeling better." Bob's blue eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to contain all 46 years of their marriage, all the love and secrets and shared silences that had built their life together. "Promise me you'll look, Maggie. Promise me you'll understand." "I promise," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead that tasted of salt and sorrow and the bitter edge of winter. That night, Margaret lay awake listening to Bob's breathing beside her, memorizing the rhythm that had been the soundtrack to nearly half her life. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the bare branches, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of snow plows working through the night, trying to keep the roads clear for morning traffic, for people going to work and school and hospitals, for all the ordinary emergencies that make up the fabric of life in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, except for the secrets they keep locked away in metal boxes and buried memories. The surgical suite fell into that peculiar hush that comes before dawn, broken only by the steady hum of heating systems working overtime against the February blizzard that had intensified during the night. Outside the operating room windows, snow fell in thick, relentless sheets that reminded Margaret of the winter her father had died, when she was 12 and thought the world might end if it kept snowing forever. Bob had been taken to pre-surgery preparation at 5:30 in the morning, his weathered face pale but determined as he kissed Margaret goodbye in the sterile hallway. "See you on the other side, sweetheart," he had said, using the phrase that had become their ritual whenever one of them faced something difficult. Dental procedures, job interviews, the births of grandchildren. Now Margaret sat in the surgical waiting area with Lisa, watching the clock hands move with agonizing slowness, while outside the storm transformed Millbrook into a white wilderness that seemed to reflect the uncertainty freezing her heart. Lisa had brought coffee from the hospital cafeteria, but it sat cooling in Margaret's hands, untouched and forgotten. "The storm's getting worse," Lisa observed, looking out at the parking lot where their car was rapidly disappearing under a blanket of snow. "Good thing we're already here." Margaret nodded absently, her mind focused on what was happening 3 floors above them in Operating Room 7, where Dr. Mitchell and her team were beginning the delicate process of removing whatever had been growing inside her husband's body for God knew how long. In the surgical suite, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood over Bob's unconscious form, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they had discovered during the initial examination. The growth was larger than the imaging had suggested, with fibrous extensions that reached deeper into the surrounding tissue than anyone had anticipated. "Remarkable structure," she murmured to Dr. Crawford, who was assisting from the opposite side of the table. "I've never seen tissue organize itself quite like this." The growth appeared to have its own blood supply, with small vessels feeding into the central mass in a pattern that suggested years, possibly decades, of gradual development. As Dr. Mitchell carefully separated the tissue layers, she began to see the outline of something foreign embedded at the very center. "There's definitely a metallic object here," she reported to the surgical team. "Approximately 1 centimeter in length, appears to be a fragment of some kind." Nurse Patricia Williams, who had been working surgical suites for 30 years, leaned closer to get a better view of what Dr. Mitchell was exposing. What she saw made her step back involuntarily. "Doctor," she said, her voice tight with surprise, "the tissue around that object, it's moving." Dr. Mitchell paused, her instrument suspended over the surgical field. Indeed, the tissue surrounding the foreign object seemed to pulse slightly, independent of Bob's cardiac rhythm. As she watched, the fibrous extensions that had grown around the embedded fragment appeared to contract and relax in a pattern she had never encountered in medical literature. "That's unusual," Dr. Crawford said, adjusting his magnification louvers for a better view. "It's almost as if the tissue has developed its own muscular structure." Using delicate forceps, Dr. Mitchell began the painstaking process of separating the foreign object from the surrounding tissue. As she worked, the true nature of what Bob's body had been harboring for decades became clear. The object was indeed a bullet fragment, but it had been encased in a complex biological structure that seemed designed to both contain and protect it. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Mitchell said, her scientific fascination momentarily overriding her clinical focus. "His body has essentially created a specialized organ around this fragment. Look at the vascular patterns, the tissue density. This isn't just scar formation. This is adaptation." As she finally freed the bullet fragment from its biological casing, the surrounding tissue seemed to collapse and then slowly begin to reorganize itself. Nurse Patricia, who had assisted in thousands of procedures, had never seen anything like it. "Should tissue be doing that?" she asked, her voice carrying the concern of someone who had learned to recognize when something in surgery wasn't going according to plan. "No," Dr. Mitchell admitted, carefully placing the bullet fragment in a sterile container. "It shouldn't, but Mr. Sullivan's body has apparently been doing a lot of things it shouldn't, medically speaking." The extraction process took nearly 4 hours, longer than originally anticipated due to the complex network of tissue that had grown around the fragment. By the time Dr. Mitchell began closing the surgical site, she had removed not just the bullet, but an intricate web of specialized tissue that had essentially created a biological containment system unlike anything in medical literature. Downstairs in the waiting room, Margaret and Lisa watched the morning pass with excruciating slowness. At 10 o'clock, a surgical nurse appeared to tell them that the procedure was taking longer than expected, but that Bob was stable. At noon, Dr. Crawford briefly emerged to report that they had successfully removed the foreign object and associated tissue, but that Dr. Mitchell would provide full details once the surgery was complete. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Dr. Mitchell finally appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing her surgical scrubs and cap. Her expression was tired but oddly excited, the look of a physician who had encountered something professionally unprecedented. "The surgery was successful," she began, and Margaret felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "We removed the entire growth along with what was embedded within it. Bob is stable and being moved to recovery now." "What did you find?" Lisa asked, her medical training pushing through her personal concern. Dr. Mitchell gestured toward the small consultation room where they had met the day before. "Let's sit down. This is going to require some explanation." Once seated, Dr. Mitchell placed a sealed specimen container on the table between them. Through the clear plastic, Margaret could see a small, misshapen piece of metal that looked ancient and corroded. "This was embedded in the center of the growth," Dr. Mitchell explained. "It's a bullet fragment, approximately 45 years old based on its condition and metallurgical composition." Margaret stared at the fragment, her mind racing. "But Bob never mentioned being shot. He said he had some shrapnel wounds, but never anything about a bullet." "Many combat veterans don't discuss specific injuries," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "especially wounds that weren't immediately life-threatening. In battlefield conditions, if a fragment wasn't causing acute problems, field medics often left them in place rather than risk complex extraction procedures." Lisa leaned forward to examine the fragment more closely. How could he not know he had this in his body all these years? In combat, especially under stress and adrenaline, it's not uncommon for soldiers to sustain injuries they're not immediately aware of, Dr. Mitchell explained. And if the entry wound was small and the fragment lodged in muscle tissue rather than near vital organs, it could have been overlooked during field treatment. Margaret nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. Bob's nightmares, his occasional complaints about back pain that he'd always attributed to years of physical labor, his reluctance to discuss his military service in any detail. "But why would his body react like this after all these years?" she asked. Dr. Mitchell pulled out several photographs taken during the surgery, showing the complex tissue structure they had removed. "This is the truly remarkable part. Instead of forming simple scar tissue around the fragment, which would be the normal response, Bob's immune system created this highly specialized structure. It's essentially a biological filter designed to neutralize toxins leaching from the metal over time." She pointed to various features in the photographs. The bullet fragment was slowly releasing trace amounts of lead, copper, and other metals that could have caused severe poisoning over decades. But this tissue your husband's body created was actively processing and containing those toxins, preventing them from entering his bloodstream. "Then why did it suddenly become dangerous?" Lisa asked. "That's what we're still trying to understand," Dr. Mitchell admitted. "It could be age-related changes in his immune system, environmental factors, or simply that the structure had reached a critical mass where it could no longer function effectively. The important thing is that we've removed both the source of the problem and the damaged tissue." Margaret felt tears she had been holding back for days finally begin to fall. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now, still sedated from the anesthesia," Dr. Mitchell said. "But yes, you can see him briefly." "I should warn you that he'll be groggy and possibly disoriented for several more hours." As they walked toward the recovery area, Dr. Mitchell added, "Mrs. Sullivan, with your permission, I'd like to document this case for medical research. The tissue structure we removed is unlike anything in current literature. This could help us understand long-term effects of embedded foreign objects in veterans, potentially helping others with similar conditions." Margaret thought of Tommy's story about Carl Johnson and Dave Wilson, of all the men who had come home from Vietnam carrying pieces of war within their bodies. "Bob would want that," she said softly. "He'd want something good to come from this." Bob lay unconscious in the recovery room, his face pale against the white hospital pillows while machines monitored his vital signs with steady electronic beeps. Margaret approached his bedside slowly, taking in the sight of her husband connected to IV lines and oxygen tubes, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him in 46 years of marriage. "The anesthesia will take several more hours to wear off completely," the recovery nurse explained softly. "But his vital signs are stable, and the surgery went better than expected." Margaret took Bob's hand in hers, feeling the familiar calluses that told the story of a lifetime spent working with his hands. Even unconscious, his fingers seemed to respond to her touch, tightening slightly around hers in the gesture that had become second nature over the decades. Lisa stood beside her mother, her medical training allowing her to read the monitors and understand the various tubes and wires that seemed to sprout from her father's body. "His numbers look good," she said quietly, more to reassure herself than to inform Margaret. Hours passed in the quiet rhythm of hospital recovery. Margaret refused to leave Bob's side except for brief trips to the cafeteria when Lisa insisted she needed to eat something. By evening, Bob's eyes began to flutter, and the nurse adjusted his position to help him regain consciousness more comfortably. When Bob finally opened his eyes fully, his gaze was unfocused and confused, the result of anesthesia and pain medication. But when he saw Margaret leaning over him, a weak smile crossed his face. "There's my girl," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed an hour earlier. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, stroking his forehead gently. "Like I got kicked by a mule," Bob admitted, then noticed Lisa standing nearby. "Hey, sweetheart. Didn't expect to see you here." "Where else would I be?" Lisa said, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "How's the pain, Dad?" "Manageable," Bob said, though Margaret could see him wince when he tried to shift position. Did they get it out?" Margaret exchanged glances with Lisa before answering. "They got it out, Bob. All of it, Doctor." Mitchell said the surgery went very well. Bob's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of what she wasn't telling him. After 4 decades of marriage, he could read her expressions like a familiar book. "What was it, Maggie? What was growing inside me all these years?" Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "It was a bullet fragment, Bob, from Vietnam." "You've been carrying a piece of metal in your back for 45 years. Bob's expression didn't show surprise, only a weary confirmation of something he had suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. "Figured it might be something like that," he said quietly. "That firefight near Quang Tri in '71. Took some hits that day." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Margaret asked, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. Bob looked out the window at the snow that continued to fall in the gathering darkness. "When I got home from that place, people either treated us like we were heroes or like we were monsters. I didn't want to be either. I just wanted to be normal, to build a life with you and forget about all that." His gaze returned to Margaret's face, and she saw vulnerability there that he had kept hidden for decades. "By the time I met you, it seemed like ancient history. The wound had healed, never gave me any trouble. I figured what you didn't know couldn't hurt either of us." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes but kept her voice steady. "We could have faced this together, Bob. All these years, you've been carrying this alone." "Maybe," Bob admitted. "But I wanted to be the man you thought I was, not some damaged veteran with shrapnel in his back and nightmares in his head." Lisa pulled a chair closer to the bed, settling in with the careful movements of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "Dad, there's something else. Dr. Mitchell said your body did something remarkable around that bullet fragment. It created a whole biological system to protect you from metal poisoning." Bob listened as Margaret and Lisa explained what the doctors had discovered. The complex tissue structure that had essentially saved his life by containing toxins that should have killed him years ago. His weathered face showed a mixture of amazement and concern as he processed the medical implications. "So this thing that nearly killed me also kept me alive?" he asked. "For 45 years," Margaret confirmed. "Your body found a way to survive with something that should have been fatal." Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, having finished her evening rounds. "Mr. Sullivan, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been through a war," Bob said with a weak smile. "In a sense, you have been," Dr. Mitchell replied, pulling up another chair. "I wanted to discuss the findings with you now that you're alert enough to understand what we discovered." She spent the next 20 minutes explaining the surgery and the remarkable biological adaptation Bob's body had created. The bullet fragment, she explained, had been slowly leaching toxic metals for decades, but the specialized tissue had been filtering and containing those toxins, preventing systemic poisoning that would have been fatal. "The tissue structure we removed was unlike anything in current medical literature," Dr. Mitchell said. "We're sending samples to specialists at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and the CDC. This could be crucial for understanding how the body responds to long-term foreign objects, especially in veterans who may have similar situations." Bob absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance that had served him through 65 years of life. How many other guys might be walking around with something like this? "That's exactly what we hope to find out," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Your case could help identify and treat others who may be facing similar situations without knowing it." After Dr. Mitchell left, the small recovery room settled into the quiet intimacy of family. Bob's pain medication was making him drowsy, but he fought against sleep as if he had something important to say. "Maggie," he said softly, "there's something else I need to tell you. About that day in Vietnam, about how I really got shot." Margaret leaned closer, sensing the weight of what he was about to reveal. "What do you mean, how you really got shot?" Bob's eyes grew distant, looking back across 45 years to a jungle on the other side of the world. "It wasn't enemy fire, Maggie. It was one of our own officers, Lieutenant Harris. He was going to shoot civilians. Women and children in a village we were supposed to be protecting." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that Margaret was only beginning to understand. Bob continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to stop him. We fought. His weapon went off during the struggle. The bullet went into my back, but I managed to subdue him before he could hurt those people." Lisa sat forward in her chair, her face pale. "Dad, you mean you were shot by your own commanding officer?" "The official report said Harris was killed by enemy fire and that I was wounded in the same engagement," Bob continued. "It was all lies. Harris was quietly transferred out and eventually discharged. The bullet in my back was American, not Vietnamese." Margaret felt the room spinning around her as the full implication of Bob's words sank in. "You've been carrying this secret for 45 years? "Couldn't bear the thought of being honored for something that felt like a cover-up," Bob said, his eyes filling with tears. "The Purple Heart they gave me is in a box in the garage. Never could stand to look at it knowing the truth about how I really got wounded." "But you saved innocent lives," Lisa said firmly. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" Bob asked, the question that had haunted him for decades finally spoken aloud. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have found another way, if I could have stopped him without violence." Margaret reached for both of his hands, holding them firmly in hers. "Robert Sullivan, you listen to me. What you did that day took more courage than any medal could recognize. You put yourself between an armed man and innocent people. You're not a damaged veteran. You're a hero." Bob looked at her with eyes that held 45 years of hidden pain. "I was so afraid you'd think less of me if you knew, that you'd see me differently." "I do see you differently," Margaret said softly. "I see you as even braver than I thought possible." Outside the recovery room window, the February storm was beginning to subside, though snow continued to fall in gentle flakes that caught the light from the hospital parking lot. Margaret watched the snow for a moment, thinking about all the winters they had spent together, all the secrets that had lain buried beneath the surface of their marriage like bullet fragments in flesh. "There's something I need to tell you, too," she said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "About my past, about why I really understand what you went through over there." Bob's eyes focused on her face with the intensity of a man preparing for another revelation that might change everything he thought he knew about his life. "Before I became a teacher," Margaret continued, "before I met you, I was a nurse, a battlefield nurse in Vietnam. I served at a field hospital near Quan Gai for 2 years, treating wounded soldiers and civilians." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady beep of monitors and the whisper of snow against windows. Bob stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, processing the implications of what she had just told him. "You were there," he said quietly. "You were in that war, too." "I was," Margaret confirmed. "I came home in '73, 2 years before we met. I never told you because I wanted to forget everything I'd seen, everything I'd done. I thought teaching children would be the opposite of patching up broken soldiers, a way to build something instead of just trying to keep it from falling apart." Lisa looked between her parents with amazement. "All these years you both served in the same war, possibly in the same region, and neither of you ever said anything?" "We were protecting each other," Margaret said. "Or so we thought. Turns out we were just building walls between us instead of bridges." Bob reached for Margaret's hand with new understanding in his eyes. "All those times you seemed to know exactly what to say when I had nightmares, when I couldn't sleep. You weren't just being supportive, you understood because you'd been there too." "I understood," Margaret confirmed, "and I should have told you. We could have helped each other heal instead of carrying our wounds separately all these years." As Bob drifted toward sleep under the influence of pain medication, Margaret remained at his bedside, holding his hand and watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in 46 years of marriage, there were no secrets between them, no hidden wounds festering in silence. The bullet fragment that had nearly killed him had also become the key to unlocking the truth they both needed to face together. Outside, the storm continued its quiet work of transforming the landscape, covering the familiar world in fresh snow that would melt come spring, revealing whatever lay beneath in its own time and season. 6 months later, the June sun filtered through the maple leaves in the Sullivans' backyard, casting dancing shadows across the wooden deck that Bob had built with his own hands 20 years earlier. The harsh Michigan winter seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the gentle warmth of early summer and the sound of waves lapping against the Lake Michigan shoreline just 3 blocks away. Bob sat in his favorite lawn chair, a glass of iced tea sweating in the afternoon heat beside him. The surgical scar on his back had healed into a thin white line, barely noticeable except when Margaret applied sunscreen during their morning walks along the lake. His recovery had been slower than either of them had expected. 2 weeks in the hospital, another month of restricted activity, and then the gradual return to something resembling their normal life. Margaret emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade, the condensation already beading on the glass surface. At 63, she moved with the same quiet efficiency that had served her well through 3 decades of teaching, though there was something different about her now. A lightness that came from no longer carrying secrets that had grown heavier with each passing year. "Lisa called from Chicago," she said, settling into the chair beside Bob's. "The medical conference went even better than expected. She said there were physicians from Walter Reed, the VA, and several major medical centers all wanting to know more about your case." Bob nodded, a hint of pride crossing his weathered features. "Still seems strange having doctors all excited about something that nearly killed me." "Something that protected you for 45 years, then nearly killed you," Margaret corrected gently. "That's what makes it so important for other veterans." The months of recovery had transformed more than just Bob's physical health. After Margaret had shared her own Vietnam experiences, the field hospital near Quang Ngai, the wounded soldiers and civilians she had treated, her reasons for abandoning nursing for teaching, something fundamental had shifted between them. Conversations that had been impossible for decades now flowed as naturally as the lake breeze that cooled their faces on hot afternoons. "Tommy called this morning too," Margaret continued, taking a sip of lemonade that tasted like childhood summers in simpler times. "The VA finally approved his disability claim for his lung problems. Says your testimony about the Agent Orange exposure made all the difference." "About time they recognized what that chemical did to his breathing," Bob said, genuine pleasure lighting his blue eyes. "Only took them 50 years to admit the obvious." Bob's decision to contact the VA had been one of the most difficult but liberating choices of his recovery after Dr. Mitchell had confirmed that the bullet fragment and tissue analysis supported his account of the incident near Quang Tri. He had finally felt ready to tell his story to military historians and VA investigators. Without naming the other soldiers involved, he had spoken his truth for the first time in 45 years. Contributing to a complex historical record that was still emerging decades after the war's end. The second difficult decision had been reaching out to Lisa with the complete story of his service, including both the physical wounds and the moral injury he had carried throughout her childhood. Their relationship, always loving but sometimes constrained by his emotional walls, had deepened through his willingness to be vulnerable and her compassionate understanding of the burdens he had borne. "I've been thinking," Bob said now, watching a sailboat drift across the distant horizon, "about that trip we talked about during my recovery." "Vietnam." Margaret raised an eyebrow, though she had been expecting this conversation. "The Veterans Reconciliation Program that Tommy mentioned?" "That's the one. He found this organization that arranges trips for American veterans to return, meet with Vietnamese veterans, visit old sites, participate in community service projects. Tommy's thinking of going in October." Bob turned to face her directly. "I think I'd like to go with him." "And me?" Margaret asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Only if you came too," Bob said firmly. "To see the places you served, maybe to close that circle for both of us. But I'd only go if we went together." Margaret reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades. "I never thought I'd want to go back there. But now, with you, knowing we both served, yes, I think it might be healing for both of us." The idea had been growing in both their minds during the long months of recovery and revelation. Vietnam had been the defining experience of their young lives, shaping them in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Perhaps it was time to see those places not as terrified young people caught in a war they didn't fully comprehend, but as older adults who had built meaningful lives despite, or perhaps because of, what they had experienced there. Dr. Mitchell had visited them at home the previous month, bringing news that Bob's case had indeed become a landmark study for understanding long-term effects of embedded foreign objects in veterans. The tissue analysis had revealed cellular adaptations that medical science was still trying to fully comprehend, and the VA had initiated a screening program for veterans who might be carrying similar hidden wounds. "She said they've already identified 12 other cases similar to yours," Margaret told Bob. Men who served in areas with heavy chemical exposure and have unexplained growths or symptoms that doctors couldn't previously explain. 12 men who might not have to go through what I did, Bob said with satisfaction. That makes all of this worthwhile. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sophie, now 6 years old and boundlessly energetic, racing across their backyard with Lisa close behind. Lisa had taken a week's vacation from her emergency room duties to spend time with her parents, something that had become more frequent since Bob's surgery. "Grandpa, Grandpa," Sophie called out, throwing herself into Bob's arms with the absolute trust that only grandchildren possess. "Mom says you and Grandma are going on an airplane to a faraway place." "That's right, sweetheart," Bob said, lifting Sophie onto his lap. "We're going to visit a place where Grandpa and Grandma worked when we were younger, before you were even born. Will you bring me a present?" Sophie asked with the directness that had started this entire journey 6 months earlier when she had innocently pointed out the spider on Bob's back. "Definitely," Margaret promised, ruffling Sophie's blonde hair. "But the best present will be the stories we'll bring back to tell you." Lisa settled into a chair across from her parents, studying their faces with the careful observation skills she had developed as an emergency physician. The change in both of them over the past 6 months had been remarkable. Not just Bob's physical recovery, but the emotional healing that had come from finally sharing the truths they had kept hidden for so many years. "Are you nervous about going back?" Lisa asked. "Not nervous exactly," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "But aware that we'll be seeing those places with 70-year-old eyes instead of 20-year-old ones. Everything will be different, the country, the people, our perspective on what happened there. I think that's exactly why we need to go," Bob added, "to replace the memories of trauma with something more complete, more peaceful." As the afternoon wore on, Tommy Peterson arrived for their weekly visit, bringing with him the easy camaraderie of shared experience and the comfortable silence of old friends who had seen too much together. The three of them, Bob, Margaret, and Tommy, sat on the deck sharing stories and making tentative plans for the October trip, while Sophie played in the yard and Lisa graded papers from her medical students. "Funny how things work out," Tommy observed, watching Sophie chase butterflies in Margaret's flower garden. "All these years we thought keeping quiet was protecting our families. Turns out talking about it was what they needed from us all along." Bob nodded, his arm around Margaret's shoulders as they watched their granddaughter discover the simple joy of a perfect summer afternoon. The bullet fragment that had lived within him for 45 years was gone, but what remained was something more valuable, the truth it had carried, finally exposed to the healing light of day. "Some crossings you don't know you've made until you can't go back," Margaret said softly, echoing words Dr. Mitchell had spoken months earlier. "But some crossings you choose to make together, and that makes all the difference." The sun began to set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded them both of other sunsets in another place, another time, when they were young and afraid and carrying wounds they thought would never heal. Now, as darkness fell gently over Millbrook, Michigan, they sat together, knowing that some wounds, given enough time and truth and love, do indeed find their way to peace. Bob and Margaret Sullivan's story reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds and share our deepest truths. For nearly 50 years they carried separate burdens from Vietnam, he with a bullet fragment physically embedded in his body, she with memories of being a battlefield nurse. Each protected the other from pain through silence, building walls instead of bridges in their marriage. It took a medical crisis at age 65 to finally bring their hidden past to light, allowing them to truly see each other completely for the first time. Their journey shows us that the secrets we think protect us often become the barriers that separate us from those we love most. Whether you served in Vietnam, lived through those turbulent times, or carry your own unspoken stories, remember that sharing your truth can be the most powerful medicine of all. The courage to be vulnerable, even after decades of silence, can open doors to deeper connection and unexpected healing. Sometimes what nearly destroys us also carries the seeds of our salvation, just like Bob's bullet fragment that both threatened and protected his life for 45 years. Have you ever discovered that something you kept hidden for years was actually longing to be shared? What secrets from your past might be building walls instead of bridges in your most important relationships? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.